Here we are with our last presenter for the session, Thomas Greiner and Stephen Ficalora. So Thomas H. Greiner is a PhD candidate in ancient Near Eastern studies at the University of Toronto, where he specializes in the cultural significance of lapis lazuli. In pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egypt, he teaches at Toronto Metropolitan University and blogs regularly for the Nile Scribes. And then Stephen Ficalora is a PhD candidate in ancient Near Eastern studies at the University of Toronto, where he specializes in ancient Egyptian wisdom texts of the early Middle Kingdom. He is a member of the National Board of the Society for the Study of Egyptian Antiques, as well as vice president of the Toronto chapter. So today they will be presenting on ancient Egyptian influences across Toronto's architectural and cultural landscape. So over to you guys. Now you can share your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much. Before we start, a big thank you to Dr. Ann Nguyen and the rest of the SASA team in putting together, I think, this exciting conference. Let me just share my screen. I hope everyone can go see our screen now. Should show a nice image of a Sphinx arriving in the harbor of Toronto.
Yes, your presentation
Perfect.
is with.
Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, for being here and for organizing this conference, letting us share our research with you. My name is Thomas Greiner. I'll be doing the first part of the lecture, and about halfway through, I'll be handing it over to Stephen Ficalora to continue our journey. Our talk today will take us into the city of Toronto, Canada, where we'll explore the way Egypt is used in the city's architectural and cultural landscape. And there are a few examples already of how the city is connected to Egypt. You can see here a Sphinx arriving in the late 1980s in the harbor in Toronto to actually be part of the staging of the famous opera Aida that was staged in the late 1980s at Sky Dome, which is now Rogers Center in Toronto. You can see here just the Sphinx being set up. We also have the presence of many Egyptians across the city, and we'll touch on that in our conclusion. Here, the building of a large-scale Coptic cathedral in style after the one in Cairo, on the border between Markham and Toronto. And we also have Toronto influence going over to Alexandria and Egypt in the loading of some of the streetcars in the 1960s that made their way back to Egypt. And perhaps most well-known about ancient Egypt and Toronto is the collection of ancient Egyptian antiquities that is part of the Royal Ontario Museum. That was an important milestone with the museum's opening in 1914. And you can see here an image of the crystal since its construction over 15 years ago. This used to be the main entrance of the ROM until quite recently. And the history of the ROM goes back all the way to the early 20th century with the leading figure of Charles T. Corelli playing a leading role here. It was through his participation in fieldwork in Egypt and has close relationships with donors and several important fellows of the British Egyptological scene that brought many Egyptian antiquities to Toronto. And in many published works, the foundation of the ROM is really seen as the pivotal event in the influence of Egypt on Toronto's population. And in this talk, we're going to go take this little idea a bit apart, and we're going to be visiting 5 contexts around downtown Toronto. So I give you a map here of the city as it looks like, with our famous landmark, the CN Tower, close to the waterfront, the ROM to the top left of the picture. And our first context will take us to St. James Cemetery. We'll be visiting a wonderful mausoleum. Then we're going to go right near the ROM, just right across the museum, and visit a set of stained glass windows. Then continue our journey by talking about a mural with Egyptian motifs that are located at Meridian Hall, formerly known as the O'Keefe Center, before we'll take public transit and end up at Museum Station, where we'll encounter, surprisingly, some Egyptian motifs, and then finish our journey by talking about how ancient Egypt is used in a modern-day Egyptian restaurant. Now, the first context that we will explore takes us into St. James Cemetery, and you can probably note here already some Egyptian influence is present with the use of obelisks in several of these funerary monuments. As we make our way through the cemetery, we actually come to the edge of a ravine, and on the top there is just the roof of what appears to be a mausoleum. And here we have the name of an individual engraved on a plaque, and it's none other than Sir Casimir Stanislaus Chowsky, who was born on March 5th, 1813 in St. Petersburg in Russia to a Polish family with origins in Grodno in modern-day Belarus. Now, Czarski would go on to join the Imperial Corps of Engineers at the age of 17, and during the studies also, they became involved with Polish resistance efforts in hopes of establishing an independent Poland. After failed attempts, he would find himself in a prison in Austria before making his way over to the United States in 1834, where he landed in New York back then. He would go on to study English and law, and eventually took up employment with work on the New York and Erie railways. And by 1841, through some familial connections, he ended up coming to Canada, where Czarski would become a well-known engineer involved with projects such as the Grand Trunk Railway, the construction of Yonge Street in Toronto, as well as the International Railway Bridge across Niagara River at Fort Erie that you can see in the photo in the top left. Now, within his home in Toronto, which was colloquially known as the Hall, and eventually he hired on architect Frederick Cumberland to build this residence, the interior featured a variety of furniture, including several classical Greek-inspired statues you can see here just at the very back through the doorframe. Now, very late in life, Czarski would go on to serve for about a year to be Ontario's lieutenant governor before passing away on August 24th, 1898. Now, knowing their life details, how did it affect the decoration of their mausoleums? Remember, we've just seen the roof before. And so in order to get to the front, you make your way down a staircase. So that would be to the right of the photo. And when we arrive at the front of the mausoleum, you can most likely already identify possibly some Egyptianizing motifs. We have here some Egyptianized columns that are heavily stylized, flanking the entrance, one on either side. And each column also features the motif of a sun disk with its rays emanating forth. Again, emphasis on it being heavily stylized. When we take a look above the columns, we notice a stylized sun disk with the outstretched wings of a vulture that sits in the center of the cornice and also occurs a few more times across the band just underneath the roof. And so it's a little bit troubling, as you've seen from the biography, short biography, that there's not really a clear indication as to why Czarski would have Egyptian elements featuring in the family mausoleum. Is the question perhaps that, Czarski catch the Egyptomania bug that was sweeping across Europe, the United States, and other parts of the world throughout the late 19th century? Biographers of Czarski, Ludwig Kosz-Rapcewicz, Zubowski, and William Greening, they note actually that several members of Czarski's family have connections to Freemasons. They might have been members of that movement. And is this perhaps the explanation behind the use of the Egyptian motifs here? Within Freemasonry, we know of a surge in the construction of buildings and lodges adopting the use of Egyptian and neoclassical motifs in the late 19th to early centuries. And when we look in the funerary side of things, we also find Egyptianizing motifs being adopted in the construction of mausolea. So you can see here just a range of mausoleums that are making use of Egyptian elements, quite different, quite often, but these all come from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries. We've got a couple here at Pittsburgh at Allegheny Cemetery, the well-known Woolworth Mausoleum in New York, and as far west as Vancouver on the Pacific West Coast, we have the Woodward Mausoleum dating to 1924. So again, maybe it's in this tradition that we should see these elements. Now, this is probably, I would say, the first instance really in the city where we have the use of ancient Egypt documented, at least still surviving today. Another building that we will visit is the well-known Lillian Massey building. So for those of you who will ever make the way over to the Royal Ontario Museum, it's just right across the road. You wouldn't really know it from the outside. The outside, again, features heavily neoclassical elements. And Lillian Massey building is actually today part of the University of Toronto. And when it was completed in 1913, the building housed the Department of Household Sciences. When we take a look at the outside, you can see some neoclassical elements, including prominently placed Ionic columns. And this is from a photo of a postcard from the early 20th century. But it's on the interior where we find some ancient Egyptian artistic elements that are being used in a set of 3 stained glass windows. That when we look at first glance, the style situates them, I think, quite well within the Hellenistic world, but upon further examination, several ancient Egyptian elements are noticeable. This building goes back to the financial contributions by Lillian Massey Treble of Massey fame, who was a major financial backer of this new department and was also keen on the decoration behind the stained glass windows. Unfortunately, they would die before they're able to see the windows. Now, the artist who was behind the decoration coming up with the program was none other than Henry Holiday, who had a keen interest in antiquity, and some of their stained glass windows are even part of Westminster Abbey in England today. He was the one to push Egyptianizing motifs to be part of the stained glass window, also in close conjunction with Charles Drake Corelli that you've seen earlier in connection with the Royal Antrim Museum. But this inclusion of Egyptianizing motif might have been to the chagrin of Lillian Massey, who might have preferred non-Egyptian motifs to be used in the stained glass window. We have a letter that Holiday wrote to Corelli in 1913, where he really tries to make the case for the inclusion of Egyptianizing elements. He writes here, "You will, of course, well understand that the fact of a building being of a classical style does not necessarily involve the exclusion of all but Greek subjects. Two considerations would lead me to suggest Egyptian domestic scenes. One, if we are to go back to the past for picturesque and interesting presentment of domestic work, it would seem reasonable to go to the earliest civilized examples. Two, the Greeks were not in the habit of painting pictures of all their occupations as were the Egyptians, so that Egypt would supply us with far more abundant authority for our subjects. I might add a third reason, that the realization of Egyptian scenes is far less common in Greek." Now, when we look at the stained glass windows, I've noted before, they are certainly located the theme within the Greco-Roman world and their design, but upon closer inspection, we do find ancient influences. As Stephen Schubert notes, Holiday had access to and in turn drew inspiration from some of the gorgeous illustrations found in some well-known 19th century publications by, for example, Lepsius, Rossellini, and Brice d'Aven. Now, quick overview of some of the Egyptian decorative elements. So, for example, in the top left image right here, you can make out a keka frieze, which is kind of the stylized version of a bundle of reeds tied together that are often decorating the top parts of walls in several monuments. We also encounter again the sun disk with the outstretched wings and a whole number of plant motifs to make part of capitals of columns and whatnot. So we have here, for example, lodiform, papyriform, and lily-shaped columns. And when you look very closely on the bottom right image, you can actually make out that the hieroglyphs were installed the wrong way around. So we actually, in order to read this, we have to, kind of turn it around. Isn't technology nice where we can just, turn it around? In looking at the panels, we can also detect some influences from Old Kingdom Egypt, so from the 3rd millennium BC, where, for example, in this scene on the right here, you can make out several of these laborers with these very characteristic wigs. We have example right here from a wonderful statue of the individualist Medchechi that's in the Brooklyn Museum, where again, in one example, you can make out like the connections right here to the statue. The subject matter of many of the scenes also find inspiration in many of the daily life scenes of late Old Kingdom private tombs, which preserve agricultural scenes. We have jewelry and other craft productions, to name some. So, for example, in this one right here, where we can see two women kind of grinding grain, we have similar examples here from it in the tomb of Mehuet Saqqara from the 6th dynasty, several women kind of threshing grain. And we even have funerary models, for example, the small limestone statuette of a woman grinding grain as well that comes to us from Giza from the 5th dynasty. Now, I will pass it over to Stephen to walk us through the next motifs.
Thank you, Thomas. So moving on to Toronto's east side is the O'Keefe Center, today known as Meridian Hall. And this was built in 1960, and it served as, and it still serves as, one of Toronto's premier centers for performing arts. It was built by architects Earl Morgan and Page in Steel, Toronto. And at the time of its construction, the city really lacked any modern performance spaces. And so Toronto Mayor Nathan Phillips at the time called for a new performing arts center to be built. Until 2006, Meridian Hall was the home to the National Ballet of Canada and the Canadian Opera Company. And today, visitors to Meridian Hall will still be greeted in the lobby by the mural, The Seven Lively Arts, by Toronto artist R. York Wilson. Wilson was a Toronto artist known for his large-scale murals during the 1950s. The mural measures 15 feet high by 100 feet long. And at the time of its creation, the mural was one of the largest painted in Canada, and received some fame when Wilson had to fight a legal battle against the US-based Scenic Arts Union, the Brotherhood of Painters and Decorators, who didn't want the independent artist to paint his own mural. The union argued that the mural should be painted by union members, like in the United States. Wilson won the battle for the right to paint his mural without joining the Union. The mural highlights 7 forms of art throughout history: painting, sculpture, architecture, music, literature, dance, and drama. Each section incorporates examples of each respective art form from what Wilson considered Western civilizations and cultures throughout history, including ancient Egypt. Within the mural's first section, paintings throughout history, are 2 stereotypical Egyptian figures on the viewer's far left, just below examples of cave art, implying that ancient Egypt was the originator of the art form. The male figure on the left wears a headdress reminiscent of the Nemes and holds what might be a lily or a papyrus stalk, and the female figure on his right wears a tripartite wig and has her hands raised in worship. Likewise, in the sculpture section, there features an Egyptian sphinx that appears to be inspired by those of Hatshepsut. Moving back towards the Royal Ontario Museum and access to the museum is Museum Station. The Toronto Transit Commission, or the TTC, was founded in 1921 and provides public transit to over 1.7 million people a day throughout its network of subways, light rail vehicles, streetcars, and buses throughout the city of Toronto. In 2008, the TTC unveiled a newly renovated museum subway stop. The station provides access to both the Royal Ontario Museum on the west side of Queen's Park and the Greiner Museum of Ceramics on the east side. The $5 million restoration by Canadian architects Diamond and Schmidt features architectural elements inspired by and drawing upon the collections of both the Royal Ontario Museum and the Gardiner Museum. These were chosen by the architects in consultation with museum curators. And the main architectural elements of the station are sculpted load-bearing columns based on Toltec, First Nations, Chinese, Greek, and Egyptian themes. These columns draw passengers out of the train and give them a hint of what is expecting them in both museums above ground. The first hint of Egyptian elements passengers are greeted by are 4 pairs of columns flanking each side of the platform, taking the shape of Osiris. The front of the columns, oriented towards passengers exiting the subway cars, represent a generic and stereotypical Egyptian mummiform king wearing the Nemes headdress and holding the crook and flail. On the back and sides of the columns, there are decorations with hieroglyphic text in raised relief, and these are borrowed from a relief of Thutmose III from Deir el-Bahri, a reproduction of which is now in the Egyptian Gallery of the Royal Ontario Museum. The text is an offering formula to the god Amun and reads, "An offering of the best fresh myrrh for Amun-Re, Lord of the thrones of the 2 lands, Lord of heaven, so that he may make a giving of life, stability, dominion, health, and his joy like Re forever." Though spaced out along the platforms, the Osiris of the museum station recall the New Kingdom mortuary temples like those of Hatshepsut and Ramses II, greeting visitors with a deified Osiris king. A second architectural element inspired by ancient Egypt are the large signs spelling out museum along the station track walls. The large orange letters are decorated with portions of hieroglyphic inscriptions. The text is borrowed from a relief from the tomb of Mechechi on display in the Royal Ontario Museum, and the inscription describes the 5th dynasty nobleman's devotion to his parents in the standard Old Kingdom autobiographical form. The 2008 renovations aren't the first time that ancient Egyptian antiquities inspired design and architecture in Museum Station. In 1975, the mummified body of an Egyptian named Nacht was on display in the station to highlight the 1974 autopsy and X-ray of the mummified body. Museum Station is currently undergoing another renovation that is set to be complete by the end of 2025, with the aims of adding better accessibility and structural rehabilitation. No design plans have been released, but we are hoping that more Egyptian-inspired elements will be included. Moving further to the west is Papyrus Restaurant, opened in 2018, and which serves traditional and classic Egyptian cuisine, incorporating ancient Egyptian design and motifs in the restaurant's decor. The central focus in the restaurant is on 3 wooden backlit panels. Incised into each of the panels is a list of words in 2 columns describing various aspects of life. The column on the left reads, sister, family, humanity, generous, eat, union, life, sun, love, and beauty. On the right, it reads people, brother, kindness, pleasant, join, make, papyrus, border, peace, joy. And finalizing the list at the bottom is the classic Egyptian formula, life, prosperity, and health. The three panels are inspired by the Rosetta Stone, displaying the message in three unique scripts, English on the left, hieroglyphs in the center, and Arabic on the right. The panels designed with the help of Stacey Davidson were created to highlight Egypt's collective multicultural history and connections to the past. As of the 2016 census, there are nearly 34,000 individuals of Egyptian origin in Toronto. With the growing Egyptian population, Egyptian influences, both ancient and modern, can be seen across Toronto's architectural and cultural landscape. New Egyptian restaurants, ancient Egyptian-inspired architecture, and Egyptian newcomers continue to enrich Toronto's diverse and multicultural setting. Ancient Egyptian influence in Toronto can be seen across the decades and will no doubt continue into the future as proud Egyptians make Toronto their new home. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are open for questions now. So we do have a question. There's one question. Am I audible? Stephen?
Yeah, you are.
So there's a question. Does the supposed need for a paternalistic view of the study of antique by the West over the East understanding of its own culture still?
I think it's a combination of both, definitely with the older examples that Thomas highlighted and that I highlighted with Museum Station and the O'Keeffe Center. It's definitely a Western view. We could see the stereotypical forms of Egyptian figures, like in the Lily and Massey windows, in the architectural forms of Museum Station and the mural representation of more stereotypical Egyptian figures. But then, you know, with more immigration to Toronto by native Egyptians, I think we're seeing kind of a shift to more of a native view of the culture, where when we go to places like Papyrus Restaurant, there is an influence of both modern and ancient Egyptian motifs within the same space.
Okay. And there's another question. Are you aware of any studies that look at the public perception of these Egyptian themes in architecture?
So what was the last part of the question? I'm aware of.
Okay, I'll just repeat. Are you aware of any studies that look at the public reception of these Egyptian themes in architecture?
Not to my knowledge. I don't think there have been any studies done. I'm not sure if Thomas knows.
Of like Egyptian themes in architecture?
Of the
Yes.
themes.
Oh, I'm aware of, I think, some visitor studies that have been done like in connection with museum collections, but of studies of like Egyptians like living abroad and how their heritage is used, I'm not aware of that much either, to be quite honest. There might be like a little bit of work that's being done, and I think that's up and coming, like with a lot more assertions of Egyptians taking over their heritage and kind of, you know, rightfully asserting their place, and that's something I can only commend and want to be part of. But like locally here, like in North America, I'm not that familiar with that. So there's been like some articles published on like these motifs, but mostly I think from like a Western perspective, unfortunately.
Okay. Okay. Then thank you. There are no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Stephen and Thomas.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.